Before we get into today's episode, I want to ask you a quick favour. If you're getting value from any of our podcasts, and I genuinely hope you are, could you take just 30 seconds right now and leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify? It sounds like a small thing, but a rating would make a huge difference, and it'll take less time than pouring a cup of coffee. G'day. Welcome to the AgriCoach Podcast for families on the land who want to grow their family's wealth and prosperity across the generations. I'm your host, Ben Law, and I'm the financial bloke. Here's something I want you to sit with for a moment. A farming family that's truly aligned in their values, in their vision for the future, and with the right guidance, it's almost impossible to derail them. The markets can turn, seasons can fail, and the world can throw whatever it likes at them. And they hold together because the foundation is solid. But that alignment doesn't happen by accident. It requires the right conversations, facilitated well, with every voice in the room heard. And most families never get there. Not because they don't love each other, not because they don't want exactly the same things, but because nobody ever created the conditions for that conversation to actually happen. And here's the part that catches most families off guard. The silence in the meantime isn't neutral. Your kids are already forming pictures of their future, with or without the farm in it, based on what you haven't said. Every year that passes without a conversation, that picture gets harder to change. So if you're serious about turning succession into success, you need the right team around you. Your accountant, your lawyer, your financial advisor, your coach. But there's one person most families forget, and arguably one of the most important ones at the table. Someone whose entire job is to make sure every voice gets heard, the hard conversations actually happen, and the family comes out the other side with a plan they've genuinely all agreed to. That person is a succession facilitator, and they're actually few and far between. Now, I've had the privilege of having a few great ones on the podcast, and today's no exception. Today's guest is James Hamilton. James is a facilitator and also a farmer based in Narromine in central New South Wales, where he runs a farming enterprise with his wife Amanda. He knows the world from the inside out, 25 years of farming and first-hand experience of a successful succession through his own family. In 2013, he launched Cultivate Advisory, specifically to help farming families navigate the transfer of management and assets from one generation to the next. James brings something rare to this space. He's not just a professional sitting across the table, he's a farmer who's lived this process, which means he understands what's actually at stake when these conversations happen and what's lost when they don't. Today, we're going to talk about what good succession really looks like, what gets in the way, and what you should be thinking about right now, whatever stage you're at. So without further delay, James, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Ben, for having me.
Yeah, it's been a while. I've been wanting to get you on and just trying to find the right time. And succession is one of those stories that people either want to hear more about it or other people go, geez, I just don't want to hear about this anymore. But I want to make sure today's really credible and really has some good takeaways for people. So I'm really looking forward to it, James.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Now, James, before we get into the work you do in not only your home life, but also in the succession side, I just want to start with you. Now, you're a farmer first, and you and your wife Amanda have been running your operation in Narromine in New South Wales for about 25 years now. And by your own account, your family succession was a real success. Your parents managed to navigate it across 3 siblings, and it actually worked. Now, because most people who go through a good succession, they just sort of get on with their lives and don't think too much about it, but you turned it into a career or a sideline gig, shall we say. So why did that experience make you want to do this professionally?
I guess because I had such a great experience. And look, when I say great, at the time, yes, there was tension. And like any people experiencing change, you don't go, woohoo, bring on change necessarily. So it was at times a little frustrating going through that process, but we were very fortunate that we had a mother in particular who had the emotional intelligence to say family is first and foremost. My father at the time, I think, did focus on economies of scale and thinking my brother and I would have been better off together from that viewpoint. but he ended up seeing reason that we as brothers were better off apart. Now, that has been the best decision because my brother and I, we still talk about it today, how lucky we are, because we're just so different. But by not having us in business together, it meant that we could just focus on our relationship. And as a result, our children have the closest relationship as cousins and with their aunts and uncles and grandparents. So I actually think that's been the greatest gift that I've received in the succession process is the flow and effect with family dynamics.
So is that the same for everyone, James? Can some families, work together and use those economies of scale?
Absolutely, and they do. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be thinking of those that they know that have or that they themselves are. So it's not that you have to separate at all. It's just being really clear what can work and what doesn't, for sure. So it was my experience, I guess, being a positive experience. And then I'm out socially and people would come up to me and say, "Oh, James, I notice you've done succession." And then they'd tell me things and they'd usually say, "Oh, look, I haven't actually said this to anyone." Yep, righto, keep it confidential, which obviously I did. And I gave them some ideas. And this is just from a raw talent I had at the time, a base skill level. Anyway, sometime later, I was then out socially and I'd circle back to them and say, "Oh, how are things going?" And they'd say, "Look, that was really good advice. It actually led to this and that." So then I started thinking, look, there's a clear need for this and I have a raw talent. I should refine that. So then I went and studied and did training. And then it was 2013 actually that I started Cultivate Advisory. So I then travelled throughout Australia working with families while still running the farm here at Narromine. And our business model here, we rely on contractors. We certainly do a lot of work ourselves, but we also rely on contractors. So spraying was getting done in a timely fashion because it was done by a contractor. And it was the same one that we'd had for a couple of decades. So we had established those key relationships to ensure the business went well. And that allowed me to go off and do other things.
And so you said your mother was emotionally intelligent enough to be able to realise that family was important and that needed to come first. Was Mum driving the process back then?
She did, yeah. And my mother may listen to this, so I want her to understand when I say she had enough emotional intelligence. She is emotionally intelligent. Yeah, it was understanding that family is everything. And it's not that my father was discounting that. Mum, I guess, could see the bigger picture. And as a result of that, sometimes when I speak publicly, I'll stand up and I'll talk about the difference, those families that the family is in service of the business. And then I'll say, or are you a family where the business is in service of the family? Now, they're absolutely entwined and you can't have one without the other, and you can't just say, "Oh, no, it's all about the family," because obviously you need to work, you need to make smart decisions. But ultimately, I would ask, why are you doing it? Is it to have a huge empire, and then for what purpose? And it will be around family, I would have thought, why people are doing it, ultimately.
It's interesting, James. I only ever come across one family in business that basically said it's about the business. Ultimately, when you dug into it, we really don't give two hoots about the family. We just want to dominate the world, and that's our focus, and that was fine. But I find myself is pretty much when you dig down to it from both mum and dad's point of view, it's all based on that intergenerational family providing security and opportunity for all generations involved. And it's just a little harder for some to articulate that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, James, so your wife, Amanda, and yourself are on the property. You've got children yourself?
Yeah, we have 3 daughters, and it's a lovely thing to be able to say. They are financially independent of the mummy-daddy bank. So we're in this purple patch at the moment. They're all off doing their thing. And we actually now, I'm 55, we're now obviously even talking about our own succession for the next generation. I had wanted to do that earlier, but when my youngest was 16, I started, and my daughter said, "Dad, is this your work shit?" And I thought, right, okay, too young. So we held off having the conversation for a few years, but we have met and talked at a bigger picture, a level as to what people may be wanting in life and general direction. And then we'll keep on having that conversation and fine tuning.
Yeah, it's a common thread I find, James, is families that seem to be able to do this well as they start the conversations early, obviously age appropriate. I have conversations with my 9-year-old that I would be below what you'd have with a 16-year-old, which would be below what you'd have with a 25-year-old. But I think it's really important for families to understand that this is a key success metric or a key factor that you see in successful families is they focus on having the conversations earlier, not to gain any traction, but just to normalize the conversations.
Absolutely. And, some people, the word succession, they shiver. Let's change it to progression. We're just progressing through. And those that actually can have these conversations, they're going to have so much more in the way of choice as to what their future looks like, as opposed to those that actually head in the sand and say, no, just keep beavering away. We just got to pay down that debt before we do anything.
And it's interesting, James, and people on the podcast have probably heard me say this many times before, but I remember there was a research study done overseas, which I won't go into the specifics because it's a long story, but essentially they came back and they said, over 2 or 3 generations, about 90% of families fail. And I think the reality is that in some way, shape or form, they're probably right. But there was the thing that really struck me was the key factor gave you a 70 to 80% chance you would thrive across the generations was that the family totally embodied the fact that strength of the family relationships were just as important as the financial strength. And so they balance them out. Not that family is everything and the finances don't matter, because the ones that say that, as soon as they hit a bad time or come off the rails, it's going to fail. And the ones that say, as long as we've got more money, everything else will be fine. It's that combination of the two. And I think it's very easy for farmers to look at the business and the money and go, okay, we've got the ship up right. We're making money. We're profitable. We're scaling up. That's good. Very few of them actually invest in the family or the communication or those conversations until, not it's too late, but until it becomes far harder.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny you should say this. Someone reached out to me and asked would I come and speak to the Family Business Association. Now, for your listeners that don't know who that organisation is, they're a group of advisors that actually work with extremely wealthy families. And I'm actually speaking with them on Wednesday morning in Sydney. So when actually getting to know this organisation, I thought there's some value in what they do. So I've actually become a member. And to do that, you actually have to study through Adelaide Uni. So I'm doing that. And we're currently looking right now, which we'll be talking about the next day, is the Darrell Lee family, a family that really strove to actually generate wealth, but it was all about the business and they forgot the family aspect. And now it's a well-documented situation where it costs them everything, financially and personally.
Yep. And that's one of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories. And I talked at an FBA function last year in Brisbane, James. So they do some great work. But it's interesting, this conversation is exactly the same whether you've got a farm or whether you've got a construction business or a chain of supermarkets. It's exactly the same problem. And I think most people are scared, as you mentioned before, as you say the word succession, people start to get shivers. Mm-hmm. They start to think about what went on with their parents. And most of the ones that come to me for help, James, that are sort of 5 to 15 years from succession, it's because they've either had a really good one or a really bad one. And they go, we either want the same for our kids or we don't want for our kids and ourselves to go through the same problem. And most of them sort of avoid it. And so that brings us round to the fact that most of the problem I find, and I'd love your thoughts on this, James, is it's just about unhad conversations. People just either don't have them badly, or don't know how to run them. So I want to hit you with this question, mate, is in your experience, what's the conversation most of them are actually avoiding, and what does it actually cost them the longer they leave it?
I think the number one would be fair versus equal. Now, when I'm working with families, if they haven't actually had that conversation within their family, I can actually have what are children, but we need another word in succession for children, but adult children.
I call them next gen.
Yeah, the next gen. So they can actually come to a meeting and in their head, they've confused what a sibling themselves or another sibling receives against what they may, and they equate it to then our parents love me more or less based on what they receive in assets. Now, you and I know as parents, it's got nothing to do with love, but it's amazing how grown adults can actually get confused, and it shows up at that emotional level within succession. Whereas if a family can actually talk, particularly when they're young, around fair versus equal and the intent behind why we may consider what is fair, because a family may say it's important that the farm continues on for another generation and that the current owners just see themselves as a custodian, but also explaining that they will ensure that all their children have some form of opportunity. And that's the word I focus on when I'm working with them. Opportunity. What opportunity can all receive? Not so much the dollar value.
It's interesting. One of the successful families I've worked with, their focus with the kids is we've built this wealth. So within the farming business, etc., how can you leverage off it? So not what can you get, how can you actually leverage off it? And a beautiful example was, if anyone wants to listen to the Barmount feedlot story with the Connigan family, I interviewed Andrew Connigan a while ago. He actually set up a feedlot software business and has been leveraging off the business's scale and size, etc. So it's about how can you leverage off that, not necessarily what are you going to take over tomorrow.
Absolutely. I use the analogy. Your parents are going to provide you with a springboard for you to launch from. So what are you going to do with that? And the joy parents actually receive in actually handing over assets while they're alive to actually then see what the next generation do, you get a lot of enjoyment from that.
So James, what is obviously when families go, we need to start having this succession conversation. And I always quite often find there's someone in the family that's driving it. And now there's some reluctant parties. There's some parties that are eager to get along on the journey. But how do you actually know when a family's ready to have succession conversations? And how do you know when they're not? Like, how do you tell?
There's the ideal, and they'll be the families that have established their communication system. They started at a young age talking about succession, so it's not the scary thing. And they're families essentially that are working with you and you with them, establishing communications, understanding that a weekly meeting, whether you call it a toolbox or a weekly and a monthly operational or planning meeting, that is at an operational level. They'll understand that a board meeting is at a strategic level. They understand all this innately. They know their roles and responsibilities, how decisions are made. Now, that's great, and I think everyone should be striving for that. But that's not to say that the families that haven't done that can't do succession. And in fact, I would say it's the majority of my families I'm working with that actually aren't ticking all those boxes. But they've got to a point where they realize they need to get on with succession. They realize that by starting the conversation with someone like myself, they can actually then start to explore options. And in my process, I guess I'm what people would say I'm non-threatening. It's not a legally binding process. I only get people to a point of agreement and in principle agreement because all agree. It doesn't come down to a vote. So no one needs to feel threatened. So when a family can actually explore what are the possibilities for everyone in the family, and then I use the asset base to explore what could be possible. And as strategic on my behalf that when I'm working with a family, I said, let's actually look at options. Don't rule anything in or out, because that then has them open up their minds as to what could be possible. And sometimes we'll even go, okay, now, if we're going this direction with this option, what's something on the other direction? And then what happens is by the end of the day, they're going, oh, I actually think that option there, that could work for us. So it's really about managing expectations within the family. So I would encourage anyone considering how do we start, just get on with it. Don't think you need to have all your ducks in a row, all lined up.
So you don't need everyone excited about the conversation. You just need someone like your mum, I'm guessing, to be able to reach out, start the conversations and start the process.
Yeah, it's interesting. I normally actually have the next gen. They're the ones that ring me. Say, oh, look, I suppose it's a 70-30 ratio. And they're, I guess, more savvy with technology and they'll be more inclined to be listening to your podcasts and they'll reach out. And I say, oh, how do I get my parents to get involved? And one, I'll say, well, encourage them to listen to the podcast. They'll get a sense of whether they think I'm talking something that resonates with them or not, and then ask them to ring me. Because obviously the owners of the assets need to be comfortable they're entering into this process. And looking back over 13 years, I've been able to get the family to a point of agreement when they work with me every time except 4 occasions. And the 4th just happened the other day, actually. And when I reflect back and I think, why did that not happen? And look, we certainly got an agreement. I pushed on and there was an agreement within the family, but it was the owner of the asset.
It was a counterfeit yes.
Yes, absolutely. And at one point I actually said to this gentleman, am I here just to rubber stamp what you've already determined? And he went, no. But I think that's what was happening. But we pushed on and everyone else in the family were able to agree on a position. Now, that day will not have been wasted because the genie's out of the bottle now as far as what is possible. And the advisors, their accountants, lawyers, financial planners, will be looking at that plan and then working with the gentleman. And I'm sure that, the reason will be seen and all the reason for it, and off it goes.
Yeah, well, it highlights dysfunction as well, James. Like when you push these things forward, if there are some dysfunctions in the family, it highlights them, and then at least and you can make decisions around that dysfunction and also get help if that's what is required.
Yeah.
I've seen some really successful successions for everyone listening out there where the next gen's walked away. They've just gone, we just can't make this work. We need to walk away. They've gone away for a period of time. They've come back. Just listening out there, I'm not suggesting anyone threaten that that's what they're going to do, but they had to walk away in the situation. They came back a few years later and it worked out to be a beautiful succession in the end. But sometimes just having those conversations brings it to the surface because there's nothing worse than sitting there for 10 years wondering, eroding relationships, building up resentment and anger until ultimately it blows up down the track. I mean, my favorite quote to say to people is, someone said this to me a number of years ago. They said, Ben, you're avoiding short-term pain. And I said, yep, I am. And they'd say, yeah, but what you fail to recognize is short-term pain inevitably leads to long-term suffering. And so suffering, if anyone's had a debilitating illness or something like that, knows that suffering is far worse than short-term pain.
Yeah.
And a lot of families just aren't worth wanting to have that short-term pain, have the conversation, get it out there to be able to move things forward. They're willing to accept long-term suffering, which, in my experience, when most families have the conversations, and I'd be interested to hear your point of view, is most people, even if it's a difficult conversation and a challenging conversation and uncomfortable, they come out the other end going, wow, I'm just glad we finally got that done.
Absolutely. The amount of times I have parents say to me, James, I cannot believe you asked the particular child a particular question and they just answered and there was no emotion attached. And I'll always say to them, yes, because I come with no baggage. So when I ask, they just listen to the question. They're not straight away going to the emotional, visceral response. When Dad asks that question, what their body went to last time they asked. So that's what I'd encourage your listeners to actually seek someone who's trained in this area to facilitate those conversations, because without coming with baggage, it's amazing how much more can be achieved. And as you just said, at the end of it, they're all looking at each other going, oh, wow, I can't believe we've got to this point of agreement and we're all intact.
And do you find they come out at the other end saying, we feel better about the world?
Absolutely. Part of my process, the last thing I do is ask for a closing statement and I hand them paper because people like to talk a lot. But I say, look, 1 or 2 sentences and then a score out of 1 to 10, how they score the process. And it's very telling that they're very happy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I tell this story quite frequently, James, but we do our roadmap workshops where we actually start the process with families to sort of figure out where are we going, the whole alignment and clarity process, which is always phase 1. And we ran one last year in, I think it was October, and we had 15 families come in. And I remember there was 3 dads walked in. And I remember leaning over to Sarah, my wife, and saying, looks like we've got 3 hostages. They came in the room, they had the arms crossed, they didn't want to be there. They'd sort of been, I don't know whether they'd been convinced to come because it was on the Sunshine Coast or whether they had been threatened to come, but they all didn't want to be there. And it was actually really surprising, not saying that no rocket science happened there over the 2 days, but all 3 of them at various times throughout the day came up and introduced themselves. There's 15 families in the room roughly. And they said, Ben, we really didn't want to be here. But oh my God, I'm so glad we had some of these conversations with our kids and ourselves. We actually had some space to have them. Now, these conversations weren't really difficult or really uncomfortable or anything like that. It just started the process. And a lot of people feel that relief to actually start to have the conversation with someone because quite often the roadblocks that you're facing aren't as big as you think they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And That's why you and I are in such a wonderful position where we love the work that we do, because we see people walk in a room. I see that all the time. There's apprehension, unsure of the future, and then they leave with optimism and they're excited. And that's a wonderful gift to be able to be a part of.
Yeah. So if someone, let's just pick a simple scenario, James. If you get someone reach out and and this is the common one I get, I even got an email over the weekend for someone that I've known where, we started having conversations as a family. We started having some little bit challenging, and then someone in the family, in this case it was dad, it could be mum, it could be the next generation, but completely shut down. Family meetings stopped, the whole process froze up. How do families actually start to have these conversations, and what does it look like when someone comes in and says, hey, what do we need to do?
So when someone shuts down, I'll just pick up on that. I think importantly, give them the space they need. Some people need to process, and they'll process at a slower pace, and it may be that they're more methodical or considered. It doesn't really matter. You just got to go at their pace. But equally, you can't go, well, your pace is we're going to wait a year.
Or 8 years.
Yes, exactly. So it's actually, I find it useful to actually talk about the cost of doing nothing. And it's not just financial, there'll be personal costs. So when people can see that, yes, the costs are, X, Y, Z, and then talk about how we could mitigate some of those costs. And there's never been a problem solved yet without communication. It's just that simple. People need to talk. And it's creating that safe environment. And that's, look, people that know me will be sick of me saying it. I create the space for all to be heard and understood. And if people feel that, one, they've been heard and then understood, they then open up their minds to exploring possibility.
Yep. It was interesting. We did a succession meeting with one of our families. You and I were in the room, weren't we, the other day? And it was quite interesting to watch how dad actually came out of his shell a lot more than normal and had the conversation, was able to say what was on his mind, right or wrong. And it's amazing how you'll see with the current generation, mums and dads who are a little bit not stuck in their ways, but really focused and driven and potentially see the conversations being less valuable, how they can actually open up far more when they are in that inverted commas safe space to be able to say what they want without, being judged or people jumping down their throat. Because quite often this is where we get to, don't we, James, where, the mums and dads that do shut down, because they've shut down 10, 15, 20, 100 times, every time that happens, people get more and more aggressive and want to shut them down when they don't engage. And so their natural reaction is just to completely pull back.
Absolutely. And hence, if people can actually find themselves as trained in this space, because an accountant generally, I can think actually a few who are really good, they can do succession because of the left and right brain going on and doing that really well. But most accountants actually will shy away from those conversations where someone's jumping down someone's throat. And understandably, most people aren't comfortable in that environment.
But does that have to happen, James? Like if you're sitting in a room, like sometimes that's actually got to come out, would you say? Or should that be shut down? Like I try to get some sense because when I talk to people, there's this real fear that it's going to turn into a complete shit show, And I've sat in a room where that's happened, where the son and dad have gone absolutely toe to toe, and I thought they were going to punch each other in the end. It all worked out ultimately, but people are terrified of that, especially families that don't ever have conflict. A lot of families that are really nice and they get along and this becomes difficult. Does that happen in the meetings, and can that be resolved?
It can. I've never had it happen in the meetings that I'm facilitating. I've certainly been warned that it may well happen because of the history. So I walk into the room with the heads up, I guess, but I've never seen a punch on. Sometimes there can be stern words, but it's actually, I guess that's why they pay me to be in the room, to facilitate that process. So yes, some of it, I have to have judgment on what you allow to come out, and then so someone feels that they've been heard and they've been able to express themselves, but without doing it so much so that it shuts down the process. So that's the balance that I'm in charge of.
Yep. And so that's the role of a facilitator, is to be able to let things go far enough that people feel heard and can express themselves, but not far enough that it's becoming unreasonable. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And as you said, as you've only had 4 occasions of families not coming out with some sort of resolution, I'm guessing that's pretty good odds for people thinking because most of the people that reach out and want help are going to be pretty stuck, aren't they?
Yeah. And those 4, they certainly got resolution, but it wasn't signed off there and then with me, because I guess I don't accept that we're going to just shut down this meeting because I have a flat fee. So I said, look, you've engaged me. Why don't we push on and actually explore what else is possible, remembering that you're not signing off on anything today. You're actually opening up your thinking. So they leave with, I gave example of that gentleman recently. There was a clear plan on the way forward. I probably will end up hearing how it went, but I don't think that I will know directly from them, because there's a bit of, keeping face.
Yep. On
his behalf. He thinks, no, I know best. But I guess as a small industry, agriculture, you do hear what goes on.
So if you're, let's say the next generation, or you're a mum or a dad that says we need to start having these conversations, because we want to always look at the positive side. How do we make this work? Because I think succession's simple. It's just not easy. And the earlier you start, the better, and being proactive and actually allocating some time to this. But, families are sitting out there. What should they actually be doing now, James, to prepare themselves in your mind so that when they do come to someone like yourself, it's an even simpler scenario to work through?
Just asking the next gen, what do they want to be doing? What does their best life look like? If they were living their best life in 10 years, what's it look like? And that's a non-threatening question to anyone. It gets them thinking, what are the characteristics? What do I want to be doing? Where do I want to be? That's blue sky thinking, but it actually starts opening up people to possibility. And if people can have those conversations, and that doesn't have to be a formal meeting. It could be even just at a casual family barbecue. And I say that with some caution, because some people can get them mixed up about strategic meetings and then just morphing those into family gatherings. I think the next gen actually feel that, one, mum and dad actually then ask the question, what am I thinking the future might look like? And mum and dad aren't committing to yes or no. They're just asking a question, what does it look like? So I think that's a really healthy start. And then starting to build on that. And it could be then, okay, well, we're going to have a formal meeting where there will be an agenda and there will be items that we need to talk about. And we're planning for the future. And, it could be, let's think of the ideal. What would be the ideal? And mum and dad, how will you fund your exit? What does that look like? What are your needs? And for me, something I've been saying to parents, particularly in the last few years, where it's a bit of an aha moment for me, because so many parents that I speak to, they agonize over thinking, how can they come up with a solution? And they'll go and spend a lot of money for accountants, lawyers, financial planners, and they present the marvelous plan to the next gen, and the next gen go, not so much. And the parents feel devastated. So my golden rule to parents or the owners of the assets is you determine what your needs are, then invite your children to a meeting where everyone knows what the meeting's about, and then you explain what your needs are. Then you invite them to be part of the solution of the remaining assets, and there will be liabilities. I've never yet done succession where there were no debts. And parents are not going to hand over an asset and keep the debt, obviously. So it's a different mindset where parents don't have to have the solution and don't beat themselves up. They can be part of forming the solution, but be really clear on what their needs are and then invite their children. And the other thing I would say to your listeners is some listeners may be thinking, look, Mary, she married a dentist. They live in Brisbane or Melbourne or Perth or wherever. They're doing particularly well. They don't need to be there. They don't need anything. And while I won't say to a parent, you must include people, I just say, well, my experience has been if you invite them, they'll come with generosity. If you exclude them, they'll do things that have you sit up and pay attention to them.
That's a really important point, James. So, yeah, invite them and they'll come with generosity. And that's going to be a inoculation against future potential issues down the track when there's an estate in place or there's any further problems.
Absolutely.
I just want to go back to a couple of things, James. The first one is these plans, I believe, have to be family developed. If they're the next generation, develop them and present them to mum and dad, or mum and dad present them to the kids. I totally agree with you. I think it's a process that the family needs to follow. And I personally believe in most situations, you need to include the whole family, because if you don't, you're going to end up with more problems down the track you're going to have to deal with. Again, short-term pain, long-term suffering. Obviously, there's exceptions to all of those rules. I just want to be really clear with everyone. But if it's not family aligned, then people aren't going to get on board. And what I always usually say to mums and dads is, you've raised these kids. They're usually smart. They're usually driven. They usually understand you. They're usually hungry for the future. You've paid for all that education. They've paid for all that experience. Why the hell wouldn't you tap into their wisdom?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why would you exclude that? And I remember we had a conversation with a family in a meeting once, and there was a 19-year-old young man in the room, and I thought he was a real top young fellow. He was working, doing a gap year up on a station up in the Kimberleys. And I remember I said, so what do you want? Talk me through your plans. And we started having a conversation. I remember Mum looked over and gone, who are you?
Yeah.
And he went, what do you mean? And he goes, well, who are you? We've never heard any of this. He said, well, no one ever asked. And so just having those conversations and saying, well, what do you think the solutions are, and getting them involved? And if they are involved in dealing with the problems, then they're going to be more likely engaged in finding a solution or agreeing with the solution when it's not ideal for everyone involved necessarily.
Yeah, it's so true. Like my point earlier, you can't solve a problem without communication.
No. And if you bring that next generation in, and again, yes, it will be a little bit harder. You've got to have the conversations, but ultimately it's going to end up with a much better scenario. Engage next generation. And for me, I know a lot of the older generations, some of them can actually freak out about the next phase. You know, I'm starting to come to that point in my life where I've got to slow down and transition, and this is difficult. I've got to go from being a benevolent dictator to a steward of the family. And it can be a little bit hard, but it also can be one of the most enthralling parts of life to have that next generation coming through. And, you know, the families I see where they're getting the next generation coming in at 25 to 30, and they're hungry and they're driven and they're balanced and they're smart and all the potential in the future. The families that do that, the current generation, mum and dad, it's intoxicating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing more and more families starting earlier. And I guess it's because the concept of succession planning has been around long enough now that everyone knows it's out there. So now it's a choice. Do you engage, or do you consciously choose to put your head in the sand?
Well, I gave the analogy, James, recently to a bunch of farmers that I did a presentation for. These farmers were all into sport, into AFL. And I said, you imagine an AFL team where they have the same team and it runs right through and it gets to the end of the careers and they're all starting to get longer in the tooth, but they've got an amazing team. If they don't nurture the next generation, you know, they're not bringing them through the junior clubs and then up into reserve grade, and they're nurturing that next generation, the club's going to win pennants or premierships for a number of years, but then all of a sudden they're going to fall into this absolute black hole. And it's the same in the family business. You know, you've got to nurture that talent. You've got to grow the business. Yeah, you want to win the premierships, but you want to sustain the premierships over the long term. And that's what the best sporting teams do, is they do that. And sometimes that means having hard conversations, raising standards, doing more, sacrificing some games to get the younger players some time on the field. So it's actually, succession for me is an absolute misnomer. Everyone thinks it's transition. When we transition responsibility, leadership, and assets to the next generation is succession. I personally say to most people, when those young ones hit the ground, you know, when they're born, you know, the foal hits the ground, that's when succession starts.
Yeah.
It's not this whole, you know, we get to 58, 59, 60 and we go, oh God, I've got to start to have these bloody conversations about these young whippersnappers. And they've also got to realize that the next generation, for the current generation, it's going to be an interesting experience, because I use the analogy of young working dogs. You know, you can have a young working dog come on the farm and they're a pup and they're running around and they're going to chase the chooks, they're going to chew your boots, they're going to pee on every pot plant in the backyard and drive you insane. But then one day, all of a sudden, if you spend the time on that working dog, preparing them, teaching them, reinforcing positively, you can have an amazing working dog. Same with the next generation. Like, look at this as just the same thing. It's going to be a bit frustrating. They're going to chew your shoes. They're going to pee on the pot plants. They're going to chase it and kill a couple of chickens. But that's all part of the process if you want a great working dog or a great next generation. And so I'd encourage every family member to go, this is part of the process. And if you leave it until you're 60, 65, you've done yourself a huge disservice.
Yeah, absolutely. You're eroding family wealth.
Yes, yeah, and wealth is money and relationships.
Yep.
Okay, James, so we're running up towards our ending here. I could talk for hours on this, but this is what I see a lot of the roadblocks. If you're talking to the young people out there, if you're in a position where you think succession is important and you want to start having those conversations, as a facilitator, what do you think they should be doing to engage mum and dad in the process so that they actually can get some meaningful traction forward?
I think they need to make it clear to their parents they're not actually saying, I want to have this conversation because I want to take from you. They need to make it clear they're having this conversation so they know what the future may look like without the parents actually stating anything. They're not even sure what the true direction is. So they just need to say, from a personal point of view, Mum, Dad, I just want to have this conversation so I know what my future may look like and is it the future I want to live into? And then I think the next generation, if they could just flag with their parents, if their parents aren't thinking in terms of succession, point out that one of the greatest assets involved in succession and one of the greatest assets that people overlook is actually time. So if you have time on your side, you'll have more choices. So if they can make that point. And parents might say, oh, look, our debt's too big. We need to get that down. Well, then I would say, point out to the parents, okay, Mum, Dad, let's play this out. The current debt is whatever it is. If things went okay on average, how long will it take? Okay, you think it's going to take 5-10 years, righto? So in 10 years' time, the debt is down to nothing or an acceptable level. The parents will go, yes. And they go, okay, well, tell me what the value of the asset's done. And invariably, it's probably doubled. So now we have an asset that is doubled with no debt. How do you think conversations are going to go within the family dynamics around those that are not involved with the business? They're just going to see this huge basket of wealth and say, well, I want a lot more of that. Whereas if they did succession within the 6 months or a year of having the initial conversation, they can actually transfer some assets and some debt and allow the next generation to service that debt. And that is also a wonderful gift. Younger ones listening to this, one of the greatest gifts I received also was debt, because it actually taught me the value of money. I appreciate that to actually generate wealth, I needed my name on a title deed, and I was comfortable working with a bank because I learned those lessons at a young age. So that allowed us to then go and buy a neighbouring country. And I think parents, when hearing it spelled out like that, they'll understand, okay, well, if we do it now, it's going to be more palatable within the family, those that are not involved with the business. And also the younger person, it won't be just the existing debt. There'll be possibly, if the family hasn't built up a lot of off-farm assets, the need to actually have a target as to what will be acceptable for the parents in their retirement and all siblings that are not in the business. So debt starts to accumulate, but that's okay, as long as they know what it is and it's done in a manageable way. And families have the ability to extend generosity in the sense that we might lock down an agreement now, but we may not act on it for 5 years. So the sister or brother who's not involved in the business may say, look, I get it. This business can't extract equity out of it to that level for me to receive something. Or it could even be a combination. I can receive a small amount now, but in 5 years' time, with no interest, I'll take X amount. They're just some of the ways. And I'm often working with families and utilising time to actually secure a long-term future.
And it's interesting that for the younger generation, we look at them and say, you've got lots of time, but they don't actually when you look at it, because, between your 30s and your 40s, that's the time when you're really going to start to kick some goals. That's when you're really head down, bum up and want to be pushing hard. And also for the older generation, you get to 50 and you think, okay, we want to start to have the conversations at 60. That'll go in a heartbeat. The amount of times I've had conversations with the older generation going, we should have had that conversation 10 years ago, and we have no bloody idea why it all went wrong. And so I would say to most families, have the conversations or start opening the conversations well before you think you need to. Like well before you need to. Because if you're having them before you think you need them, it's probably right spot on the right time.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
And a great example of that, James, again, is it's like prenups. A lawyer said to me once about a prenup, it's easy to get an agreement of what you want to do with your assets when you're in love. It's very hard to come up with an agreement when you hate each other. when you're getting divorced. And that's why divorce lawyers make so much money. It's the same in succession. If you can start to have these conversations when relationships are going okay and, everyone's excited about the future, which if you hit your kids when they're in their early 20s, they're excited about the future. Yeah, they're hard to focus sometimes. I get it. But most of them are pretty excited about the future. They've moved out of home, they've finished uni, they're into their career, they're working on properties. The world is a great place. Have the conversations then when they're aspirational. Don't wait till they're 40 and then all of a sudden got the shits with the world. Like, it's an exciting time, and if you can do that. And I think the last thing I'd probably leave in there, James, is for families is the amount of times I've heard people say, oh, we had that conversation and it didn't go well. Or we started the process and it sort of got put in the too hard basket because we were upgrading that mill, or we bought that other property, or we had another crop to put in. Consistency is the secret to success. And if you have started and it didn't go well, go back again. If you haven't started, start now. If you should have started 10 years ago, start now. If you've got lots of busy stuff on in your life, like buying a new property, a little bit of debt reduction, that's all BS. It's excuses. Start now and be consistent.
Yeah.
Because I'm guessing from your point of view, James, to tie this off, it's very rare for families to come in, have a conversation over a succession facilitated conversation over 1 day or 2 days or whatever it might be, that you'll actually come out with a solution and it's all done and dusted.
I actually do get agreement, but it's a roadmap, an agreement around a roadmap.
Yeah, so we've got clarity and we've got alignment, but
Yes.
we haven't executed the plan. It's not like we can just sort of dust our hands off and go, oh, that was hard work, but geez, we've got it done. It's a process they've got to follow, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what everyone's actually requiring, particularly the next gen. They're screaming out for it. They actually just want to know, what does the roadmap ahead look like? And then to anchor in, and I guess another analogy I use is ring fence. Okay, what is being ring fenced for the one on the farm, the ones off farm, and the parents? And then use time to secure the options.
It won't happen overnight, but it will happen.
Yeah.
Well, James, that's been fantastic, mate. We could talk about this for days, I'm sure. I think there's some real gold nuggets in there for people. And before I get to the last question, if people want to find you online or get in contact with you, James, how can they go about doing that?
Cultivate Advisory is the name of my business. So cultivateadvisory.com.au. They'll see me, and on that website, they can get a feel for me. And then if they like what they're seeing, they can then shoot an email through to me. And my phone number's there as well. If they want to ring just directly, or an email, I'll get back to them.
Yeah, perfect. So, James, is there any little tidbit advice you'd want to give any families out there before we wind up today? Any one little gold nugget you want to leave us with before we go?
I know I'm banging on about it, but time, and use it well. And it goes back to in my younger years when I'm someone who's wired, always looking forward to the future. And when I look back, I was probably not so much in the present. I was always thinking of the future. And then knowing this podcast was coming up, I was reflecting on that. And then I thought the answers were right in front of me. When I was at uni, in this manicured quadrangle stood a sandstone sundial. And on the sundial were the words, use well the present moments as they fly. And now at 55, I think, wow, it was all there in front of me. Use it now. Use your time well. And to your listeners, use this time well to actually plan for your family's future success. Don't think, oh, I'll do it later.
Because later may not be around.
Yeah, you're just going to erode choices for you and for the next generation.
Awesome. Well, James, I thought that was fantastic, mate. Great advice. Time is one asset that we cannot replenish.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that was another good succession conversation. And I get it's a topic that a lot of people want to hear about, but also don't want to hear about because it's such a triggering thing for a lot of people. But I really want to hammer home the point that, when you follow the process, when you start early, when you consistently move in the right direction, succession can be done. And it's simple. It's just not always easy. And so I think the core message that James sent in there is start early, start to have the conversations. You got a few tools there to do it. One thing that I really wanted to take out of that, other than the time issue, was that James mentioned that his mother had enough emotional intelligence to be able to lead the family through this. And I just want to leave you all with this, is if you're sitting here listening and you're thinking, gee, as a family, we need to do this, whether you're a mum, a dad, or the next generation, take the lead. Someone in the family actually has to grab the bull by the horns and take responsibility. And if you're the next generation, this is part of your leadership journey. If you want to lead the family or lead the business, these are the skills you're going to have to learn. So don't wait for mum and dad to step up and start to do something. Take action yourself and start to have those conversations. And if you can't get traction, there's two things I'd recommend. Is number one, reach out and ask someone for help. Get a facilitator or someone to have a conversation with the family to get things moving. Because quite often it's like a rusty nut and bolt. Sometimes you need to just spray a bit of WD-40 on there and move the bolt back and forward gently to free it up. And that's what getting someone in can actually do. And the second one is share this podcast with them. The amount of times I've had mums or the next generation come in and said, we can't get dad to start to have a conversation about succession, or we can't get mum and dad or the kids, get them to listen to the podcast. It's a really good way for them to be able to hear the story, hear the conversations that we've actually had. And it could be the one thing that actually opens up the door just enough for you to get your foot in there and start to have these conversations. Because at the end of the day, if you don't do something now, as I always bang on about, you avoid that short-term pain, you're always going to lead to long-term suffering. And the argument that we'll just get through the next season, we'll just get the next crop in the ground, we'll just get the debt down a little bit, we'll just until we've integrated that next property, is just kicking the can down the road. And later on, it's always going to be later on again. It's always going to be, well, we've just bought another property, or wait till we get a better season. Now's the time to have those conversations, and maybe sharing this podcast with someone you know could be the thing that actually changes things for them. Now, that's it for today. Until next time, I'm Ben Law, I'm the Financial Bloke, and remember, it's more important who you are than what you've got. I'll see you next time.